welcome back to the channel. You're riding with me in the Murci, and for those of you that have been asking me to do a video on how I do the engine oil change on the Murci, well, you're in luck because the Murci needs a service. So I'll go ahead and go through and show you how to do that. One thing I will say is that in all the videos I do, I try and pass on information I've learned and possibly some cost-saving measures or strategies. Nowhere does that run true more than a V12, and especially a Lambo V12. The price of admission is steep, and the cost to pay can be quite painful. So as those of you that own these cars know, a trip to the dealer can sometimes be quite painful for the wallet. And those of you that are interested in getting one of these, you always want to keep that in mind. Or you could be one of the minority that have one of these and they sit as you have to wait to repair them. Usually that's not the case though, because if you can afford one of these, you can probably afford to fix it. But nobody likes to just give away money, right? I mean, I sure don't. So doing an oil change on this car will save you tenfold in comparison to the other jobs I show you. Along with that, parts are very, very expensive on this car. With that, you want to make sure that you feel comfortable and your skill set is up to the level of taking care of one of these cars. Now, in my opinion, this car is no harder to service than the F430 or the G. But where it changes is if I make a mistake. The cost to repair is astronomical in comparison. So there is a bit of caution that should be taken before you take it on if you haven't done it before. Other than that, have at it. So let's take a look and see how it goes. Once you're up in the air, the main thing is that you need to start by dumping the oil tank or reservoir. The tip I will give you is the lift arm on this side, rear driver. You want to make sure that you're far enough forward along the frame rail to make sure that you clear the plug. Or if the arm is in the way, then it just takes you more time to readjust and go up again. So that'll save you there. Then all you have to do is pull the rubber plug and you can see access to the oil tank. Now the oil tank has two plugs, if you will. So there's a plug inside of a plug. Now, there are a lot of horror stories that you'll hear about the tank pipe coming down, which is the drain bending. A lot of times the problem will be is if the big plug comes loose and then you're trying to torque it back down, or it's super, super tight and you try and come off of that. The little plug itself is much easier to get out. And instead of just pulling on it really hard, for me, the fastest way is just hit it real quick with an impact. That will hopefully pull out the little plug, leave the big plug intact. And when you torque down, you don't have to really get on it and possibly bend that pipe. All right, let's see if we get lucky. So I'm going to use a 17 millimeter and just try and knock loose the plug. Oh, looks like today is a lucky day for me. All right, once you're loose down there, it did come out. Just take this guy, drop it, and there we go. Once I let it go for a few moments, then I will take a sampling bottle to take an oil sample. And that looks good. That is a way that I do it to be as quick as possible. Now, the right way to do it is to pull this duct that sends cooling air to the manifolds, pull this tray down, and then use a wrench so you can hold the plug in place while you break the small plug. Once you do that for the first time, if you torque the small plug at the right torque, it should come out. I know this because this is what happened to me, but we'll see how it goes. Here we have the dry sump pan. There are two plugs on here, and it uses an 8 millimeter hex, I believe, which is correct. We'll see if we can break these free. Then of course to the front. Let's see if we can pull them out one at a time. There we go. Good. Talking about the oil pan is an interesting thing. One of our good subscribers, George, who has a Murci himself that is much nicer than mine, decided to take on the service work himself. But he did contact me with a question, and the information's good, so I'm always happy to pass it on. He asked me if I'd ever seen the drain plug on the pan stripped. To be honest with you, I hadn't. But I gave my friends at Lamborghini Newport Beach a call, and they did inform me that they have seen it before. And the process that they take is they pull the pan, send it to the machine shop, have it repaired, change the gasket, put it back all together. At a deafening cost, everything is good to go. And that is definitely the right way to do it. Or you could take on doing the inserts yourself if you're equipped and have the skill set. There is another option, and that is something that I've learned through racing, because sometimes I just can't get to machine shop or even the equipment in my own shop. So I'll pass that on to some of you as an option. However, I definitely wouldn't recommend it. It's just something that could possibly help you get out of a tight spot, whether or not be the Murci or another car. If you want to do it on the car, this is how I would do it. I would go to drill out the hole that's stripped, and I'd have an assistant to use a high-powered vacuum cleaner to grab any contaminants that might come off as you're drilling. I use a pneumatic vacuum because it's got tons of suction in comparison to electric. As I'm drilling through, the hope is that everything gets pulled out. Then after that, the next step would be to tap out the hole. And when you go to tap out the hole, I would use thread cutting grease, because then the tap will grab the debris from when you're cutting the threads, and oil does not do the same job. Once you're done tapping, you would also want to clean out the hole as good as you can with a Q-tip. Then what I would do after that is use a lightweight oil such as a 020 and flush out the system. So you'd be dropping that oil, it hopefully pull the debris out of the pan. Now it's not 100%, I guarantee you that, and you want to chase it with the engine oil you're going to use, but it definitely would reduce the odds of something going wrong. Now to pull the filter. Now to fill the new oil filter. All right, I put some oil on the seal, and now I'll send up the filter. I'll replace the copper washers on the drain plugs and send them back in. Once the plugs are in, they can be torqued down to 45 Newton meters. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the plug in the tank back in. I've replaced the copper washer, so I will just go ahead and clean it and then send it up by hand. The odd thing is, in the service manual, from what I can see, both the big plug and the small plug are 40 Newton meters as a torque, plus or minus 5%. So what I did was, to try and keep the upper plug in, is I torqued down to 42 Newton meters and I went 38 on the small, and that's usually what allows me to get it out without pulling this whole thing apart. I will caution you, always take a visual above the nut on the pipe that comes off the tank. There's a support that's welded up there to the nut. Make sure that that is still welded in place, because if it isn't, you want to pull everything down, because there's nothing to support that pipe, and that will bring most likely very bad times. Now I will just put the plug back in, and then we can drop the car and start filling. Now that the Murci's back on the ground, I'm ready to fill the oil system. The flavor of choice this time, Castrol Edge 540. As many of you know, I've experimented with multiple types of synthetics and have netted the same results from the lab. So I just keep trying different types of oil to see what type of results I get. I'm gonna go ahead and try and fill the system with 13 quarts. I measured 13 coming out. It is always a good idea to measure what comes out, because then you know exactly what's going in. I've seen all sorts of crazy things, from people changing their oil pans to the literature not having the exact amount that you're supposed to put in. So that's the way I do it. I do remember that somewhere, I believe it's this car, I was supposed to put 10 quarts in, then fire, let it warm up, and top off the rest. But since I measured 13 coming out, if it'll take the 13, I'll just go ahead and fill the system. That way I can just top it off once it's warmed up. Okay, the oil system's filled up. I'm gonna go ahead and light off the car 3 times to help prime the system. What I noticed even on the race car is that the more movement you can get that oil pump to pump oil without combustion pressure, the less wear you have. So I'll go ahead and light it off 3 times and then let it warm up. Well, that seemed to go pretty well. Everything looked good. I was able to get the car up to temp. And all these different dry sump cars have different procedures typically on how to check the oil. I always revert back to the owner's manual and would recommend you do the same. On the Murci, they're looking for 80 degrees Celsius of oil temp, the car running for at least 5 minutes, which all of you know, to get 80 degrees Celsius temperature in the oil, you would most likely definitely need to run more than 5 minutes. 60 seconds idled down, kill the car, and then wait for 30 seconds. Well, I killed the car. It has now been about 30 seconds, so we'll pull the dipstick and see how it looks. Now, as we can see, we are spot on, right at the full mark. So everything seems to be going rather smooth. Now that the oil change is done, I want to check the clutch condition, as I always do, and I highly recommend, whether or not you do it yourself, or if you're taking it to the dealer for service, ask them to do an e-gear snap. If you take it in for service, they're most likely going to do it free of charge. At least that's been my experience. Anytime you bring it to the dealer for any work, if you can have an e-gear snap done, it's a great idea, because then you have an idea of where you're at, where you're going. It'll give you an indication if something is going wrong, and potentially some very large costs coming down the road. So let's take a look and see how the Murci looks. So we can see there that the clutch currently has around 21% wear. The Murci currently has around 10,400 miles on it, so for an e-gear that would seem pretty good. Let's take a look at some documentation. When the Murci had around 8,206 miles, I had an issue where the car just stopped and wouldn't run, and then it would cool down and it would run again. Well, to make a long story short, it turns out that I had lost the e-gear potentiometer, which was bad times, but luckily I knew that the problem was the potentiometer because the Leonardo had already told me, so I was well prepared and had a good feeling that it was going to be engine out, because to get to the top of the trans where the potentiometer is, you have to pull the engine. At that time, of course, I was extremely busy with farm work, and so I decided it would just be easier just to send it to my friends at Newport Beach. Great plan, right? And actually, that just ended up being a very expensive plan, because when the Murci got down to Newport Beach, they pulled the engine and trans out, and what they found was that the potentiometer had failed, and they also found that the throwout bearing was leaking oil. And I don't know if any of you know this, but the Murci throwout bearing is around $4,000. I think they were nice enough to give me a discount, which got it maybe down to around $3,500, but still very expensive for the throwout bearing. So since Newport Beach was in there anyway, you got to do the clutch. If you have all that cost in labor and it's out, I don't remember what the clutch was going to cost, but it might have just been an extra $5,000. So it was well worth just doing it. You already know what I'm going to say. Around 8,200 miles, it had a brand new clutch installed. So that means right around now, 8,000, 10,000, around 2,200 miles. That's the amount of clutch wear I've had. Now, I do drive fairly aggressively, and that would substantiate it. But the most important thing is you just want to remember that that cost is there if you want to get into a Murci. And if you have a Murci, it's a good idea to keep an eye on it, because then you know that expense is coming. And you can maybe set some funds aside like I usually do. When the Murci goes into the dealership, it's around $15,000. It's just kind of a given rule. But I was very lucky on this job because it came out to be only $14,375.22. So I was able to get a massive savings, and I felt quite lucky about that. But the main thing is, just make sure you understand what you're getting into if you want to run with one of these, and if you own one, you're well aware of this stuff, but it is a good idea to always keep an eye on that clutch life. Now, for the best part of any service, the test drive. you enjoyed that video on how I do an oil change on the Murci, and I hope it'll help you out, whether or not you're a Murci owner or thinking of becoming one. And on that happy note, I'll see you next time.